Aaron Rodgers looking for Devontae Adams. He's got it. DJ Moore has a pass to the end zone. Jonathan Taylor, touchdown. Pass is caught. Diggs, touchdown.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to RotoViz Overtime on RotoViz Radio, brought to you by Blue Wire. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. And as always, I am joined by my co-host here on the show. It is Shawn Siegele. Of course, you can find him as well on Stealing Bananas and much, much more, along with Ben Gretsch. You can find all his work as well up on rotoviz.com. Shawn, we had a fun show earlier this week where we kind of broke down the playoff brackets, what we thought might happen over these next kind of 4 or 5 weeks, and who would end up winning the Lombardi Trophy at the end of it all. Interestingly enough, we did agree on who we thought was going to win. Spoiler alert for anyone that didn't hear that show yet. We did go with the Packers as outright winner, but we had a couple of differences along the way. For the purposes, Shawn, off the show to start things off today, I did go with a Bills-Packers Super Bowl. So I did go against your Chiefs, and funnily enough, all season long and in the early preseason, and even dating back to last year, the hope of the show was to get that elusive Packers against the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. So for the purposes of today's show, where we will be setting up kind of diving into what we might do as a lineup for the Super Bowl, I will reverse that pick, and I'll go with the Chiefs-Packers Super Bowl as well, to see if we can also parlay that into a top prize over at the FFPC Playoff Challenge. So Shawn, today's show should be a fun one. We'll be talking some strategy. We did talk through how we think things will advance. So now we'll be talking more about the players that we think will have that impact. But looking forward to the Playoff Challenge. It's always one of those fun contests to enter, and it should be a fun show to run through today.
Colin, when you first started there, I thought maybe you were going to amend your prediction to Bucks Bills, just so that you had your sort of emotional bases covered.
Yeah, that probably would be better for me, especially after how last year played out. It hasn't worked out too well for the Packers, and they have always done well getting to the playoffs and into the later stages, but since the Super Bowl win, it has been a case where they've fallen at that final hurdle a couple of times. So I'm pretty confident and hopeful that won't be the case this time. Shawn, we did mention it on a couple of shows recently. We are starting to post these videos off the podcast to our YouTube channel as well. That is the RotoViz YouTube channel. So head on over if you haven't already and check that out. Maybe you are over there and you're watching it on the YouTube channel. You can leave us a comment there in the comments section. But it's been a lot of fun on getting the feedback on those videos. So this one will be going up over there as well. Shawn said that if we got to 1,000 subscribers over on YouTube, we're approximately in the low 300s at the moment, but that has bumped up from when we asked for to bump it up to 300. So if we could bump that up now to 1,000 over the coming weeks and months, Shawn has mentioned before that we will give away a 1-year RotoViz subscription, and depending on when we do it, we may also be giving away some of those RotoViz rookie guides, which I would recommend heading on over and signing up for over at rotoviz.com. But Shawn, as we get into the playoff challenge, some of our listeners may not be fully familiar with the format. The FFPC do have 2 separate options. There is the $35 entry fee, and there is a $200 entry fee. So I think in terms of the overall structures, we are in pretty much the exact same situation to set these lineups, and I think it's going to be fun. So it's picking 12 players. You pick them before the Saturday's games kick off, and then they roll all the way through the Super Bowl. The other caveat is that you can only pick 1 player per team. So I think that makes it very, very interesting. I know a lot of our listeners will also play in DFS contests, and you're wondering about ownership and how things will play out there. The interesting thing with this is because you can only use 1 player per team, so there's no ability to stack. You're left in a position where even the guy who may be the 3rd or 4th option on the team may be very relatively low owned, and that means you can be differentiated at those spots. But Shawn, when we go into a contest like this, what should, I guess, us to go and win it look for, and what should the listeners be looking for in terms of some of the optimal strategies?
Well, the obvious thing that we want to do here is make sure that our roster fits together and that we have a scenario playing out through the playoffs that makes sense. And a lot of times people tend to think of that in terms of stacking a team and potentially even stacking an opponent, playing that out. Obviously, you can't do that with this. So you have to go into a little bit more of a I wouldn't say more depth, but a different mindset in terms of thinking the scenarios through. What quarterback maybe you need on the AFC side to pair with an elite tight end on the NFC side, or vice versa, some of those types of things, but also how you want to play the running backs versus the wide receivers in terms of what you think the game environment is going to be starting out here in the first couple of weeks, but then also who is going to advance and what that means for the high scoring players as we get down the stretch. Also, as you mentioned, how do you create a roster that is differentiated and at the same time still has exposure to these very top guys? So players like Cooper Kupp, players like Davante Adams, in all likelihood, you're going to want to have them on your roster, on multiple rosters if you play a number of teams. But then as you move through on some of these other teams, you've got to figure out how you're going to make that work with those guys so that you both have a lot of points, but also, again, the scenario that plays out and leaves you with a team that's alive at the end. So that's the beauty of it. That's the fun of it, kind of a different way to think on this one. It makes the tournament a lot of fun. Even the kicker and defense, I mean, we had some situations last year where you could look at the teams even a couple weeks in and see what the overlap with players were. Maybe it wasn't going to be the difference between the very top prize and second place, but you could see that there were teams that had other teams covered that were very good based on even what their kicker and defensive selections had been early than as you go along. So we think about the 11th and 12th players, kicker and defense, obviously, but then even the 9th and 10th players, some of these teams that are going out in the first round, you need to get big scores from those guys as well. So even if you're projecting a team to lose, you need the right guy off of that team in the loss. So those are some of the things that we'll think about as we go through this. And Colm, let's start in the NFC here and go through a few of these teams, starting with your Green Bay Packers. The obvious play here is Davante Adams. He is the best receiver in the NFL. He scored a lot of points for us in the final week of the playoff contest. We would expect if the Packers make it deep into the playoffs that he will be a big part of that. But the Packers do have some other weapons, including Aaron Rodgers. One of the elements here with the double points in the Super Bowl is that if you think the highest scoring player will be Aaron Rodgers, then you might look a little bit in his direction. Obviously, one of the things that we see this season is that Rodgers probably the one big-time quarterback where he's going to have one less game than Josh Allen, than Patrick Mahomes. If you want to go a little bit deeper in terms of the sleeper element, than Joe Burrow. And because at least at this point, he's not getting a ton of rushing, and so much of it is funneled through Davante Adams. I mean, he might be a lower scoring option than just Adams. So you have that. The really contrarian play here, Colm, would be to go with Aaron Jones or even A.J. Dillon. If for some reason you thought that he was going to be the big touchdown scorer, was going to get a lot of carries from inside the 5-yard line during this stretch and might be the guy. Obviously, last year it was Leonard Fournette. Maybe some very mild or strained parallels between those two players as we look at how this year's postseason could play out.
Yeah, and I think like that's where it gets interesting. So we talked about, and the reason as well, we'll talk through these players. We're going to start with the NFC and go to the AFC after, but we had a lot of questions in about different playoff contests. So I know some people mightn't be playing at the FFPC, but might be playing in some other formats. But that's where we're going to hit the players and then talk about it from that perspective. Just the one caveat I would say with the FFPC is that it is tight end premium. So when we talk about tight ends, we may be boosting them up a rank or two, but in these particular formats where you can only pick one per team, it makes it interesting because you just named 4 Green Bay Packers players, but realistically, a huge percentage of the contest is going to play Davante Adams, probably in the 70+% range, and then that's going to lead to the players that play the other 30%. There's going to be quite heavily on Aaron Rodgers, and then we'll see the 2 running backs coming in very lightly owned. And I think the other thing that I would look to here, Shawn, is when we have players who are projected to be quite lightly owned, but we can't really be 100% sure of how that backfield plays out. Like we've seen Aaron Jones have 4 touchdown days. We've seen in the recent times that we're seeing A.J. Dillon having some of those big days. And we know the playoffs are going to go through Green Bay for as long as they're in there. We know that the temperatures are going to be down low and they probably will look to lean on the run a little bit more. So I think if we're playing multiple contest entries, I think sometimes the confidence level in pivoting to one of those guys in each of those tournaments is probably the safer bet. In terms of the ownership, Shawn, before we dive directly into the question you asked me, when we have these players like a Cooper Kupp or a Devontae Adams who are probably going to be in that very high 70+% kind of ownership range, and then we have guys like Travis Kelce are probably not going to be far off in this particular format, how much are you putting into like having those guys on your roster because there's a good opportunity that they're going to put up those points versus being contrarian and having an alternative option on your roster to kind of go against the field on those plays?
I think it depends a lot on what you think of the secondary players, because if you have a secondary player that you like, you can create a big potential advantage there very easily by just moving to that guy. At the same time, I don't think that you need to come off of them because there are so many different ways that the playoffs could potentially play out. We have a lot of potential upsets. You can structure your team to be very unique and yet still have those two players. And I think that that helps create some overlap with other teams that are going to be good, and yet you can differentiate in some ways that don't cost you that upside. So if you have another guy, if you like an Aaron Jones is an interesting type of player. He averaged over 15 points per game this season. You talked about some of the reasons why the playoffs could be more run heavy. We do have the element where the Packers at times are frustratingly slow in terms of, I mean, they're down there at the very bottom in terms of seconds to snap. We know that they're going to be a very efficient, milk the clock, and you're not necessarily going to get the same type of shootout that you would expect with a similar caliber quarterback in a different offense. And so there are some reasons to think that the running backs could score a lot of points. And even though over the course of a season, we would expect those points to be spread in a way that doesn't quite create the upside, one of the kind of controversial things going into the season is, how will Aaron Jones score when he's got A.J. Dillon there? He averaged 15.4 points per game, which is good, but he only had 3 20-point games. And so even if you start to stack those together or line them up and say these are all going to happen in the postseason. So 3 20-point games plus, I should say, obviously, the 40-point game. So much of the 15-point per game average comes from that game. That was all the way back in week 2. And so we look at how he scored recently, and it just doesn't have that same type of upside. Let's look at the Rams, right? They have Cooper Kupp. He has been, he should be the NFL MVP. I was looking at some betting lines for that yesterday, and evidently Aaron Rodgers has come around to being the almost guaranteed MVP. I'm not exactly sure how that works since Cooper Kupp was far better, but you lead your team to the number 1 seed, and that's going to take precedence in a lot of people's minds. So we get there. Kupp is there. Akers is maybe the incredibly gutsy play. He did play a handful of snaps in week 18, looked feisty, right? The burst was there. That's not always what we get from some of these guys coming back off of injury. Obviously, Sony Michel could be somebody who gets a lot of goal line carries if Akers, isn't really ready, gets nicked up just a little bit. I think sometimes you can get close there, and then even a tiny setback is going to be pretty devastating for having the type of workload you would need in a playoff contest. You have Matthew Stafford. He's someone who, because of the way these scenarios play out, will probably not be rostered on a ton of teams. Do you have any plays that you like here? If you're in a contest where you're actually trying to stack a bunch of these Rams, is Odell Beckham somebody that you would put with Kupp and with Stafford?
I think if you're in a situation where you can have multiple players, I definitely would be going that way. I know it hasn't been like, Odell Beckham from his rookie season since he's gone to the Rams, but it has really picked up in terms of what he did for the Browns versus what he is doing for the Rams. So I would certainly in those situations be putting him in there as the second wide receiver, and Van Jefferson's probably in play as well. We did see Higbee have the big week this previous week, or the big half, I guess, before things started to slow down a lot for the Rams. But when we're looking at the Rams for this particular purpose, I think you mentioned the running backs, but I think it's very, very hard to look away from Kupp in this. And when we're looking at Stafford in terms of having a quarterback from the NFC, while he has had production this season, he's not going to be my pick. Like, so he's not. I think if you're looking, for me, it's quite clearly between Rodgers, Brady, and Kyler Murray from the quarterback side on the NFC. And we will talk about the AFC later, and I think that's where we'll probably end up leaning for our better quarterback value options, I think, in terms of where things would go. For me, with the Packers and with the Rams, I think you kind of pick the chalky players or the high-owned players in Kupp and Adams, because you touched on the likes of an Aaron Jones who could have 3 20 to 25 point games in a row, between the Packers here. But if you look at Adams or Kupp, for example, they can have a 40-point day in one of those games. So you're looking at easily eclipsing that. And then the other thing to take into account is if the Rams were to get to the Super Bowl, you're getting that extra game for the wild card as well. And the other, Shawn touched on it a little bit there, but the other benefit of this is if you play in the Super Bowl, you get double the points in that one as well. So things to consider with these wild card teams: if you get them to advance through to the Super Bowl, then you're getting that extra game from the likes of the Packers and the Titans, and you're also getting the double points in the Super Bowl. So I think it's going to be very hard for me to move away from Adams and Kupp in those two situations. I think it's going to be some of the players then probably on the AFC where we start to differentiate ourselves. When we look at the Buccaneers, and I think people are probably a little bit frightened of the Buccaneers as players have kind of fallen down over the last couple of weeks, but they have been able to get Gronkowski back. Mike Evans, who went down briefly in the last contest and had been hobbled for a couple of games before that, looks like he's going to be okay for this week. And then Leonard Fournette looks to be rounding back into the mix again. Of course, you have Tom Brady, who continues to defy father time at this point in his career. So with the Buccaneers, we mentioned, wanting to have Kupp and Adams likely on these rosters. Are you leaning towards Evans, or are you heading over towards Rob Gronkowski at the tight end position?
Well, one of the things that we see with the Bucs, as you mentioned, the loss of Godwin, the loss of Antonio Brown. The flip side of that is that now we can be very confident that Mike Evans and Rob Gronkowski are going to be heavily, heavily involved. They also have Leonard Fournette coming back, which gives you this option of a running back who really has this hybrid ability and the really heavy workload, which we're actually not going to see from that many other backs in the playoffs. And so he becomes someone who I expect to be on a huge number of rosters. The other thing that you have with the Buccaneers is they play the Eagles in the first round. This is one where you have to have a lot more confidence in them to get through than any of those other teams on the wild card side on the NFC, right? Where you have this game between the 49ers and the Cowboys that could be very exciting and maybe even lean a little bit in the 49ers direction. You have the game with the Cardinals and the Rams. The Cardinals, maybe the most demoralized team from a skill position perspective. I mean, it may come down to it's only DeAndre Hopkins who's gone, but at the same time, DeAndre Hopkins is the guy who's vastly most important. And so a situation there where the Cardinals could be limited, that makes Kyler Murray the interesting play, because with his rushing ability, he can still score, won't necessarily need the option. Won't necessarily need weapons to do the same things that these other quarterbacks are going to need, but that also means that you don't have as many options there on the team. If you don't have those options and you think the Cardinals have a chance, it's going to push you in that direction if they can make it through a couple of games. And we've seen them be very competitive with good teams. Even during this stretch where they've been down, they defeated the Dallas Cowboys, right? And so from that perspective, we like the matchup with the Rams. We've seen them play down to the final play with the Packers. It's pretty unlikely, I think, when you have a team that's missing a key player, a team that's inconsistent, a team that is not hot, that they would go multiple weeks and make it through. But any of these individual games, they could be a big problem. The Buccaneers, you're much more likely to feel like you're going to get that second game, and that might determine how you approach this in terms of how you want your players and your positions to be distributed there. Rob Gronkowski, someone now who with the tight end premium can score just an absolute ton of points. That paired with a quarterback from the AFC side might be pretty interesting. I was looking at the thing. I'm not sure how much they're expecting Gio Bernard to play, but he and Fournette both activated. If there's a situation there where you lose a little bit of the receiving for Fournette, that could knock him down. If they're trying to protect him a little bit, maybe not give him the same workload that he had for so much of the season in order to have him ready for round 2, round 3, that type of thing. Maybe that knocks him down. But I think the other thing there is just that Gronkowski is such an exciting play that will balance it a little bit more. Otherwise, Fournette is going to be one of these guys who is on a huge number of teams because, Colm, the running back options simply are pretty limited.
Yeah, they're very limited. It's interesting. You mentioned the Cardinals there and Kyler Murray, and I think he's a very interesting option at quarterback. And obviously, then if we're looking at tight end premium, we do also have Zach Ertz, who's had a really strong run here since Hopkins has been out of the lineup. But the other player that would probably fit in there is James Conner. We're still obviously waiting to know for definite what the situation would be with Chase Edmonds, and this game is going to be the last game of the week as well. So these lineups have to be submitted by Saturday. So that makes that one a little bit tricky to have confidence. And I do think Conner is somebody who could be a running back option. You mentioned Fournette. We mentioned the 2 Packers running backs as well. Interesting as well, we do need a kicker and a defense. And I know in terms of the spreadsheet that you have done, Shawn, kicker for the Cardinals is a potential option. Is that where we would probably lean here based on what obviously we know where the kind of layout of this team is possibly going to look like? Or are you tempted with the likes of Ertz or Conner to fit into that lineup?
Ertz is tempting if you think that the Cardinals are going to lose and are going to trail big early and have this kind of 1 week spike score. Because like we mentioned in the open, you need to score a serious number of points even from your guys who go out. And so again, on the AFC side, we'll be looking at that a little bit there. We know that the Cardinals have had a variety of games in which they did have big performances from Matt Prater. Obviously, the kicker position is going to be mostly just taking a team that we think will be eliminated. But the tricky part of that is that you want them to be eliminated but not embarrassed such that they are immediately game scripted out of even going for field goals. And so you might take a kicker from a game that you still expect to be competitive, and the Cardinals-Rams game, I think, fits that category, where we could see a game with a lot of possessions. We could see a game with a lot of points. We could see the Cardinals stay close, but ultimately go down in a game where when they had options to kick field goals throughout the game, they took those, as opposed to always going for it on 4th down or even being in a situation in the second half of games where maybe there are a lot of 2-point conversions. All of those things are going to siphon off a few of those kicker opportunities. You and I had a number of sort of tricky choices down the stretch in the main event where we had Boswell and Carlson, and each week the thing you're trying to figure out is, well, which team is the least likely to get blown out so that we don't have that kicker super low score. I think that is a direction we could be looking there. And I should just say that when we talk about the Buccaneers versus the Eagles probably a team that we won't take any players from, in part because we expect them to lose, in part because there aren't a lot of great options. They actually have some very good skill players, but the path for the Eagles to win this game is to try and limit the total number of plays. You do that by what they do, which is running the ball a lot, using Jalen Hurts as a hybrid player. But we wouldn't necessarily expect the target volume to get Devontae Smith where we need. You wouldn't necessarily expect the target volume to get Dallas Goedert where you need. It's not that that couldn't happen. I mean, he would be a play similar to the Ertz play, where if the Eagles get down early and have to chase, Goedert obviously has the talent and is going to be in a role there where we've seen some big games from him. They also have some talent at the running back position, but we don't know how healthy those guys will be. Tricky to pick the guy, also likely to be split. So when you talk about a low play type of offense where not a lot of targets, the running back touches are split, it makes it very easy to completely fade the Eagles. But that doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily lose this game. Jalen Hurts has played well, especially over the second half of the season. If you can keep the total number of possessions down and things break in your favor, one of the things that you and I like to mention, my co-host Bananas, Ben Gresh definitely likes to mention, is that there were a lot of breaks that went the Buccaneers' way during their run to the Super Bowl last year. if a few of those breaks go the opposite way in a slow-paced game where you don't have a huge number of possessions, you're done in the first week. And so that is something that could happen. It probably doesn't influence how you want to structure your playoff team very much, simply because the Eagles don't have a lot of great options to play.
Yeah, that's really fair. And with the other two teams in the NFC, because they are going to face off, I think I'll pair them together. And we have the Cowboys and the 49ers remaining. In terms of, like, Dak Prescott is somebody who I think people can start in this tournament and be pretty confident about it. But I mentioned earlier that for me, really, it comes down to Brady, Murray, and Rodgers if you're in the NFC side picking a quarterback. But you also have, the running backs in Dallas. We're fading both of those guys in this tournament. Then you have CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper and Dalton Schultz for the Cowboys. And then with the 49ers, you have Elijah Mitchell, Deebo Samuel, who I don't think we can talk any more highly of at this point, Sean. Brandon Ayuk, who we like. And then, of course, tight end superstar and George Kittle. So I think the 49ers are going to be very, very interesting. But I don't think listeners are going to be all that surprised in terms of the two guys that we're going to be looking to target here.
Yeah, Dalton Schultz, pretty interesting, right? Because he has two different 4-week stretches where he's over 20 points per game in tight end premium. And so we know that the upside is there. We know that tight ends are going to score a lot of points. The second stretch was the final 4 weeks of the season, actually at 19.5 there, but finishes with 4 consecutive tight end 1 performances. He's over 20 points per game twice in that span. And so Schultz, someone you can definitely play. I think this comes down to Schultz or Lamb. And Lamb, I think the actual exposure that people have will be interesting, right? Because he's still the name. It's still a situation where he could bounce back and have a big stretch. If Lamb has a multi-week run here of the kind that we think he's capable of, not only will it really fuel the Cowboys in a situation where, they're going to need that, right? To an extent, they've feasted on some of the weaker teams. They've had some games that expose some real warts. They may be the highest ceiling team on the NFC side when you consider how good their defense is as well. Just absolutely loaded in terms of skill positions on offense, game-changing impact performers on defense. And yet, there are still some big inconsistencies there, some big holes in the opponents that they're going to face in terms of the 49ers. And then however it goes forward from there, you're looking at a situation where those teams can exploit those weaknesses, as opposed to some of the teams that they have been sort of humiliating over the course of the last month or so. But we know that they could go through. They could get deep. You mentioned that Dak isn't your preference. He's also someone who can score a lot of points with these various weapons if the game goes in the right way. And so interesting to see how that plays out. But with Lamb, if he gets hot here, then I think what you're going to see next season is, again, that sort of mid-second round pick, where if he doesn't, I think with the number of elite wide receivers and the guys who now are very clearly going to be ahead of him going into 2022, guys like Kupp, guys like Samuel, he could slide back down into the middle of the third round again, as people are concerned about how this is spread. And you think about how many points Dalton Schultz is scoring, and that's not great for Lamb. All those points are coming out of not necessarily his median performance, but his ceiling. You think of what he would need to do to have the type of outcomes that we were hoping for him, and some of these other guys just simply can't score as many points as they're scoring right now. So I think Schultz is interesting there, but Lamb, if you think that he's going to be on fewer rosters than someone of his name recognition or the glitz there might indicate, then a little bit of an interesting play. But Colm, the team that I think really we're looking at here, because especially if you're playing a non-FFPC contest and you can stack a bunch of these guys and you're looking at what could be a little bit of a Cinderella team. Now I realize that they're a Cinderella and at the same time very trendy. People watched how the 49ers came roaring back against the Rams, how hot they have been, how reasonably well Jimmy Garoppolo was playing. You combine that with this running game that we know they bring to the table, but you think about their run to the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, obviously humiliating the Packers along the way, having the Chiefs beaten in the fourth quarter before the Mahomes magic takes over and wins that game. This team doesn't have that level of dominance in the running game. They don't have that intimidating level of overall result where they're coming in as the heavyweight. But there are a lot of ways in which this team is so similar to that team, yet with a much more developed passing attack, to where now you have Debo as one of the best players in the game. He can help you in both phases. You have Brandon Ayuk emerging. You still have George Kittle there as someone who can absolutely destroy the tight end position. Now, he's been cold for a couple of weeks, but previous to that, had the stretch that carried our buddy Michael Leone into the final 12 in the FFPC best ball. When you have a lot of options like that, you have multiple pathways to win the individual game. You also have this ability to really rain points down on teams if everything comes together and you use all of those guys. This is a team that I think when we talk about scenarios that could play out, you want to be on the 49ers. And then if you're in formats where you can play a lot of guys from the same team, and it's important that that team gets deep with those players, San Francisco, one of the most fun teams in terms of thinking about what could happen in this year's playoffs.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very relevant, and I think it's going to be fun to put these teams together as we go through it. We have a fair idea where we're leaning, but looks like, Shawn, I don't know if we can actually say that it truly is, but it looks like we may almost be putting as much towards a 0 RB team in this contest together as possible. So far, fading some of the favorite running backs. We'll see if that continues. And I guess the spot probably to start that with is Derrick Henry and the Titans. Obviously, they're getting a bye week here, and that there is a game missed for them. But interestingly enough, and it's been talked on a number of shows, you and Ben talked about it in Stealing Bananas, in terms of the Titans not being the favorite team to win the AFC and nearly being like on the borderline of being the third favorites along with the Bills there. So the likely players here are quite clearly Derrick Henry and AJ Brown. I think they're going to garner pretty much all of the ownership for the Tennessee Titans. Is Derrick Henry somebody that's on your radar for this? I know that he's, if it looks like he's going to be healthy, which it does, I think he's going to be very, very popular, one of the most popular players in the tournament.
Yeah, well, what's your take on this? Because I had mentioned with Ben that you and I were probably thinking about fading the Titans, maybe even completely, because there's this potential for them not only to lose in the first game that they do play once they come off of the bye, but to lose in a manner where the points are sort of split between Henry and Brown in a fashion where neither one of them scores enough to even be that like high scoring game in a loss. So one of your players who's eliminated in the first round but scores a lot of points, they might not even really fit that category if they can't get Henry going to the extent that they take over the game. But then as they come back, if Brown is thwarted, then you don't want to play either of them. The flip side of that is this element that you are, I guess, not really alluding to, but just flat out saying, which is that the Titans are not expected to do what a normal number one seed does. And so in many cases there, it'd be a sense where like, well, actually, maybe we want to try and benefit from that. If a lot of people are going to be fading the Titans, then how would we get in on that and play it such that we weren't in that group? Right. And that could be a way that you change your team up. The problem is just that they don't have a lot of options. Like you said, it's Henry or Brown. And you might say that Brown is a better option in a game that they trail and lose. I think that there is an element to that. Obviously, his huge game a couple of weeks ago came in a situation where they got way down or down enough that there was a lot of pressure on them from the 49ers and then come roaring back because AJ Brown was just unstoppable. He was who he has been to set these records.
Who we thought he was.
Points over expectation. Yeah, I mean, so we could have some games like that to where they're in trouble and really go after it. I think the only way to potentially play this and benefit all, come out ahead, would be to have Brown. And so that was kind of our question. Do we want to be on Brown there, or do we want to be off the Titans almost entirely? Maybe play them in a situation where that's where we have our defense, because you have, I think, we have a lot of good feeling tied up in Joe Burrow. Obviously, Joe Burrow is also very good. Beyond that, has the weapons. We expect them to come through the Raiders, but that's not guaranteed. I don't think that there's any big gap between the Bengals and the Chargers, and we just saw the Raiders really control a game. I mean, the Chargers had to do one miracle after another to get to that point where there's overtime. So the Raiders are a team that could win and advance, but if we're looking at the Bengals, we think that the Bengals will win multiple games, but yet what are likely to be their foibles as they go through? And we could see a game where Joe Burrow throws for 400 yards, but is also sacked 6 or 7 times. And that obviously would be favorable for the Titans defense. Where are you on how we should get after the Titans? Do you see kind of any type of sleeper play that has any realistic chance of paying off?
I think you're looking at Henry, Brown, or the defense, and you kind of alluded to them all there. And I think Henry's going to be the popular play, and we've mentioned so far, Adams and Kupp and Lamb will be relatively popular, and then Samuel. So we're kind of going with a lot of popular players so far. So I think getting down to a second or third option on some of these teams is the way to go. I think the defense is an interesting play because obviously we have to start a defense and we have to select one as we go through it here. But the way that we did Tuesday's show talked through kind of the options in our brackets and how we thought things were going to play out. We think that Cincy are going to take care of the Raiders. And then my biggest fear with the Bengals is they go into the playoffs and there's obviously not the same experience in this team that maybe in some of the other playoff rosters, and they kind of freeze up and they think we have to focus heavily on the run game, or we get into the lead, we have to just see out the clock or kill out the clock, and they don't really go for it. Whereas we've seen games recently where when they have had to really put up yards and put up points, they've been able to do that. And that's my one fear with the Bengals. And if the Bengals proceed to move past the Raiders and face off against the Titans, then you're in a situation where if the Bengals come out and do what they have been doing, I think it's going to be very hard for the Titans to keep up with that without going the route to Brown. Now, you made an interesting point with the defense. If we are fading them and trying to take the defense in this role, I think they will put a lot of pressure on Burrow, but I think that I would be still leaning towards Brown or the defense in this situation. I'm going to go. It's one of those ones that may definitely 100% come back to haunt me if the Titans go on a Super Bowl run and Derrick Henry is the man that takes them there. But I think over the course of this run, it's going to be a case that if they face off against the Bills or the Chiefs, I think they're going to be in a similar situation where I'm projecting them to be against the Bengals, where they are having to pass to keep up. So a bit like the scenario you mentioned a couple of weeks ago when Brown had that big game on Thursday Night Football, he is probably the one that I'm edging towards here. Looking through, Sean, we haven't really touched on running backs that we're looking to have on the rosters, and I mentioned thinking the Bengals would take care of the Raiders. So I'm going to go for Bengals and Raiders here and kind of tie them together. The team we were probably most on all off season last year and then through this season was the Cincinnati Bengals. And at the start, it was kind of something that probably sounded strange to people, and then it got trendier and trendier. But there is a lot of skill position options in this contest for them. So we have Burrow, Mixon, we have Jamar Chase, we have T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. Then on the Raiders side, the options are more limited for what we would be looking to use. Hunter Renfrow, you could probably toss into the mix as well here, but it's realistically going to be Josh Jacobs and Darren Waller. And again, Waller getting the bump in tight end premium. But I think some people who would have drafted him this year early in drafts and tight end premium may be still feeling the effects of that and maybe a little bit reluctant to click him into the lineup. But when we look through these teams for the Raiders, I am starting. This is where we look towards running back, I think, Sean, with Josh Jacobs. But I think the real interesting decision then comes on the side of the Bengals, where I think Mixon will be quite popular. You do have Burrow, who finished the season incredibly strong. You have Chase, who just had a phenomenal stretch in the fantasy playoffs. And then you have T. Higgins. I think Tyler Boyd will be one that is likely to be much, much less owned than those other four guys. But I think the interesting choice on this is for us and our roster builds. I think we're going to be looking between Chase and Higgins and Burrow. And for this build here in particular, I think we're going to be looking at one of the wide receivers. I like to go for the slight. I think this is where you start to get those little options to get slightly different than just picking all the most popular players. Because as I've mentioned, we've picked a lot of popular guys. but starting to differentiate a little bit. I think Higgins is the one that I would go and be picking up here. Are you finding it hard to make that decision between Burrow, Chase, and Higgins versus like who you want to have in this tournament?
I think if you're going to play a couple teams, the most fun way to do it is to have a Mahomes team and have a Burrow team and kind of build off of that. You look at where we are with some of these running backs, and especially if you have a Mahomes team as opposed to a Burrow team, then Josh Jacobs becomes interesting in that Raiders-Bengals game because it gives you kind of multiple ways to play this. You can have Higgins there as your wide receiver. You can have Jacobs as your running back. Either way that game plays out, you're still fine because you're not losing your QB. So if you go Mahomes, then Jacobs, I think, is more or less a no-brainer. He's the player who can catch some passes, going to score those goal line touchdowns. He hasn't had the ceiling that we've hoped for this season, in part because the Raiders offense now, during this time period where he hasn't been competing with Kenyon Drake, hasn't been losing some of those touches, this period where he's looked very good, they also just have a lower ceiling overall because they no longer have some of the other pieces that they needed to be a juggernaut offense. And yet at the same time, he's somebody I am very confident could have a multi-week stretch of big points. He's also someone who could score big points in a loss based on how they use him. So both of those elements there create this opportunity to have a multiple paths to winning. If you don't have Burrow as your QB, obviously if you're picking Burrow as your QB, you need him to stay alive and match up with some of these players on the NFC side as we look toward the Super Bowl. So those are sort of the considerations there. And I do like going to Higgins. It is an element a little bit like Lamb too, where I'm interested to see what people actually end up doing in the end, because I think that could be a pretty popular pivot. A lot of sharp managers thinking if we can just get off of Chase there, if you like Chase, then he should be your guy, right? Don't move off of him just to change the look of the lineup, because I think a lot of other people will be doing it. And because of the running back options that we have, or in this case, 2022 don't really have, Mixon should be very, very popular.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think the two wide receivers are going to be very heavily rostered along with Burrow, but how that plays out is going to be interesting. And that's obviously going to affect multiple positions, and particularly the quarterback position, depending on what we see happen with Burrow. You mentioned Patrick Mahomes there. Like, this is another game where we talked about on Tuesday's podcast, we expect the Chiefs to really put up a number here and beat the Steelers quite easily. We may be out on that, but that's kind of our current expectation. So we have Mahomes. I would be passing over the Chiefs running backs. I know we have Edwards-Helaire there and we have Williams, but I think I'd be passing over them as an option. Then we have Hill, who's banged up at the moment a little bit, and then we have Travis Kelce as well. So we'll pair these games together again to put them together. But at the moment, it looks like we'll be fading the Steelers in this particular lineup that we're working through. We probably, full transparency for the listeners, we probably all have multiple entries in, so there will be some of these players mixed up in different combinations. But we have Harris at the running back position, and then we have Deontay Johnson. We have guys like Chase Claypool who could be options, and then we have Pat Freiermuth, who's been quite solid as a tight end and tight end premium formats this year. I think Harris and Johnson are probably the two on the Steelers that we'll be looking at, particularly even if they are getting blown out. I think they're still I think everything with Ben Roethlisberger at this point, you have to look at, average depth of target and how far he can actually throw the ball accurately. But I don't think that's going to affect either of those guys too much. So I think I'll be fading the Steelers, but those would be the two options that I'd be looking at. But with the Chiefs, I feel like with the Hill injury, that's going to lower his roster number a little bit. And then we have Mahomes and Kelce. But you alluded to it a moment ago when we talked about Burrow and Mahomes in this particular. We're going to have a couple of Mahomes teams. We're going to have a couple of Burrow teams. But this one lining up to be a Mahomes team, I think he is probably the optimal quarterback in this format to go with, based on the the projections and the betting markets and how people think that the Chiefs are going to do. And based on our projections where I flipped on this show, we're predicting him to get to the Super Bowl. So that will be a double quarterback points game there if he makes it. So what's some of the differentiators you're making there? And with the Steelers, is there the fade off the Steelers completely? Are you very tempted to go with somebody like Deontay Johnson?
Yeah, at this point, we're also looking to actually get running backs who could go into the lineup, because it is going to be a very zero RB-ish team. They just don't have the workload profiles that you need, which I think also makes Najee Harris kind of interesting. This is one where we're fairly confident that the Steelers are going to lose. That Bills-Patriots game is more of a toss-up, even though the Bills are solid favorites there and really feel like the other big threat in the AFC. And so a little bit depends on how different you see that and how concerned you are about keeping as many players alive as possible. I think if you're trying to keep as many players alive, then you're going to lead to Damian Harris, and you're thinking, okay, even in this game that they lose against the Bills, he has multi-touchdown upside, probably not going to get the receiving, with Ramondre Stevenson siphoning some touches. The big game probably isn't there. And we even have seen in some of their blowout victories that the big game isn't there, because then, again, you do have Stevenson. This one might be a game where Harris gets one of his biggest workloads of the year as they try to defeat the Bills. So you have that possibility. And then if they go through, obviously you would much rather have Damian Harris and still have somebody going than to have Najee Harris, who you think is eliminated. On the other hand, again, you're kind of playing for a particular scenario to play out if you want to win or get deep into this tournament in terms of how high you can finish. And from that perspective, Najee Harris just has a lot more single game upside. So if you're having a hard time figuring out how you're going to put those running backs in there, he becomes pretty interesting, because you mentioned the depth of target. Obviously, if you're looking at the number of passes thrown to a running back in the late third and the fourth quarters as you're trying to come back, I mean, we could see a game not to the level of his massive target game early on in the season, but a game where he actually flirts with double-digit targets, and then you get a couple of red zone carries, you get a couple of carries inside the 5, and suddenly you're looking at a game that's not that dissimilar to the big points he put up in the Week 17 victory over the Browns, even in a loss, right? I mean, if you look at a game where the Chiefs lead by 2 touchdowns early, 3 touchdowns midway through the third quarter, you're starting to look at, Kansas City up, say 38-14. Those 14 could come from Harris, but then also a lot of the production as they try and score a couple of garbage time touchdowns could also come from Harris. I think Harris versus Deontay Johnson is an interesting choice there if you're not worried about one of those guys being out after the first weekend. And so, again, if you're confident in the Bills, then I think you want to move a little bit more in the direction of actually playing one of these players from the Steelers that you only expect to get one game from.
Yeah, and then the other game you mentioned, the Bills there as well. The other teams left are the Bills and the Patriots, and we've leaned quite strongly towards the Bills picking up the W in this one. You hinted on some of the shows this week on both Stealing Bananas and our OT show that if the Bills are going to have a run here, they're going to have to get Stephon Diggs back in the mix, back to his high scoring best. So again, one of our all-time favorite guys is Stephon Diggs. So we're probably going to look there quite closely. You also have Devin Singletary, you have Josh Allen, who has been, again, a phenomenal fantasy quarterback this year. And then if we look at the Patriots, I think it's, for us, I even know as much as you love Kendrick Bourne, you haven't added him here to the sheet as a potential play for the Patriots, but we have Damian Harris and then Hunter Henry for the Patriots as potential options. Is there anyone outside of them and outside of Kendrick Bourne that's of strong interest?
I don't think so. Right. I mean, you have Hunter Henry, who's had some good games, but when you look at the other tight ends available in this format, I just don't think you can play it that way. It's such a long shot play. Now, I mean, is there a scenario where this game doesn't play out as a low scoring, grinded out affair, or plays out that way, but when they get down close, he scores 2 touchdowns, uses his targets to get in the end zone twice, and that's possible. But I think that you have to take the workload from Damian Harris if you're going to not fade them entirely, because number one, you need to find a way to get running back options into the lineup. And number two, you just want to take the workload, especially when it's workload for a player who has established himself as one of the NFL's upper echelon types of talents. Not a star, but someone who is good and will use that workload to give you a lot more of both the floor and the ceiling than Henry does. Positionally, it's interesting that we have so many more good tight end options than running back options.
Yeah, and I think obviously we've kind of run through. I think, Shawn, we have had all the teams there. I'm pretty confident we've had all the teams in both the AFC and the NFC at this point of the show. We're doing a mega episode here of RotoViz OT, but we're not going to give away all our players. It's that we've hinted at who we're leaning heavily towards here. We can't just give away our entire lineup. We don't want to be duplicated and have to split that $500,000 top prize. That was a lot of fun to run through. It is the FFPC Playoff contest, but there's lots of other playoff contests out there. And I did mention at the start of the show, a lot of questions coming in, DMs on Twitter and some emails around different options for setting your lineups in those playoff contests. So I thought running through them like that is probably more beneficial to people if they're not in that contest as well. So they would have ideas of our kind of thoughts for the playoffs on the players. So hopefully for people who submitted questions, that helped out a lot. I mentioned at the start of the show too, we are posting these videos. It won't be every single podcast, but it will be a couple of podcasts a week. So we obviously have our 3 podcasts a week audio form, and then we'll have some of them being posted slightly after on video. So you'll still get them as early as possible on audio, and you'll get them then maybe half a day to a day later on video. But subscribe to the RotoViz YouTube channel, and you'll be able to get access to all of those videos when they do go up. We'll hopefully have some fun stuff coming for you throughout the off season. Shawn has said that we will do that RotoViz subscription if we do hit 1,000 followers or subscribers over there. So head on over, click that button. If you're listening to today's show, I know we have far more people listening to today's show than are subscribed on the channel. So head on over. I will add that link to all of our upcoming shows so we can build up those numbers as we move forward. As always, you can get yourself a 10% discount to RotoViz NFL Pass. If you do wish, you can head on over to rotoviz.com/podcast for more information, or you can go to the checkout page, add that subscription to your basket, and use the code RVRadio2022. That code is now updated to RVRadio2022 rather than our previous code. That is going to do it for today's edition of the show. We will have a podcast coming your way on Saturday ahead of the playoffs. That'll be myself and Shawn coming in. Shawn and Ben, of course, with Stealing Bananas coming out this week as well. Head on back, listen to Wednesday's show. Fantastic episode from the two guys. Have a listen in there. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. And of course, you can check out all Shawn's great work up on rotoviz.com. If you have any suggestions for topics or content for future shows over the coming weeks, I've had a number of suggestions that are very, very good from listeners over the last week or so. We'll be trying to implement them, obviously, as the off-season schedule will allow for more of those deeper dives. And until we're back with another show, of course, have a good one. Thank you for listening to Overtime on RotoViz Radio. Please rate and review the RotoViz Radio podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. You can contact us via email at rotovizradio@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at RotoViz Radio. And remember, you can always support the pod by subscribing to RotoViz with a discount through the RotoViz Radio homepage, rotoviz.com/podcast.